Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Well, hello, everyone. Today, my guest is Steve Scanlon, the CEO and founder of Rewire Inc. And today, we're going to talk about how to change the way you think so you can change your business and your life. Welcome, Steve.
Great to be with you, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So the first question I ask every guest, tell us your story. How did you get to be who you are and what you do?
That's such a great question. If you were to give me, and you have to do that in 3 minutes or less, or 4 minutes, I'm just trying to prepare my story. How long do I get?
Yeah, 3 or 4 minutes is great.
Okay, here we go. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of all places, given that I live today in Portland, Oregon, and I lived in Hawaii. I moved to Virginia. I lived in Italy for 3.5 years, met my wife. She's from Italy. Brought her back here. We now have 4 kids. I have 2 grandkids. And I have been in the executive coaching business for 2.5 decades. That came after a career in which I was the national production manager for a mortgage company and had already bought and sold. I think I bought and sold 3 businesses before I was 30 years old. And then I, into my mortgage career, heard about executive coaching. I have a background in athletics. And I just think probably because of my athletic background, I didn't even know coaching was a thing until I heard about it in the mid to late 90s.
Wait a second. I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt. You were an athlete. Presumably you had coaches.
Yeah.
But you didn't know coaching was a thing.
Well, I didn't know exactly.
Outside of athletics.
That's right. That's right. And I will even tell you this, even though I was a high school All-American, I was a springboard and platform diver. Full scholarships at the University of Hawaii, and then I graduated in Virginia. And, I took that sport pretty far. Well, the funny thing is, and what part of the story is, I was pretty good at diving. I wasn't great. I don't have the physiological makeup to be great. What that did was, I've always seen athletes, this is a broad categorization, but athletes, when you see a world-class athlete, it's some combination of some God-given or natural given ability with the desire to grow and learn.
Yep.
So many people get ability, whether or not they have that desire to grow and learn. Other people get the desire to grow and learn and be good, but weren't given the natural ability. I think those people make good coaches because I knew what it was like to try really hard. Because I've been coached by some really amazing people who are naturally gifted, and they don't really have the ability to even sometimes see what it took, to get there. They'd be like, I don't know, do that better or whatever. And I actually, by the time I was 16 years old, I was having parents come to me and ask me to work with their kids. And I think by the time I got to college, I was a better coach of the sport than I was an athlete. And I was a pretty good athlete. So in some ways I felt almost called into this work. And so when I heard that this existed at a business level, I was highly intrigued. And in fact, in 1999, when I learned about it, I effectively quit my job and got into a U-Haul and brought 4 kids and my wife and 2 dogs to Portland, Oregon, where I began a coaching career. And now it's 2.5 decades later.
Wow. That's quite the story. And you were telling me before we started the show that you do an awful lot of science, neuroscience, and real scientific approach to this. As a physicist, right? As a scientist, I love that. So talk a little bit about how the science plays into what you do.
Absolutely. So I would say, and I wish I had some point in time conversion for people who would make my story that much more succinct and poignant. I didn't have a point in time conversion. Over time, when I first began coaching, over time, I mean, I was in the business of coaching because I wanted to see human beings change, right? I wanted to see human beings achieve some potential, reach a goal, do something that they didn't do. And so technically, Steve, I was in the change business.
Mm.
The challenge I had was literally for the first decade of doing this, I wasn't seeing what I would today refer to as sustainable and authentic change. I could get people to change things, but it wasn't lasting. And so somewhere around the 2008, I don't know, again, 2000, middle of 2008, I began to ask a different question, and that had to do with human development and human change. Well, if what I was doing, holding people accountable, telling people to do stuff, giving advice, doing all this stuff, it was weird. I was helping people make some behavior modification, but the minute the accountability or the whatever it was turned off, so did the behavior. And so the question I began to explore was, what is it that actually created sustainable human change? What change? What was it? Well, what I now tell people looking back is, if you ever asked that question and you were serious about understanding how the brain changed and how human beings actually changed, number one, I think you'd find yourself primarily in the field of emotional intelligence, because we now know that the changes to our limbic system and our limbic part of our brain are probably have a much greater effect than does our prefrontal cortex, right, where we have logic and language.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so that just brought me on a journey of, I started taking all kinds of coursework in emotional intelligence. I learned about who Dr. Daniel Siegel was at UCLA, who was the head of neurobiology. And he basically created his own, over the years, his own field of study that he called interpersonal neurobiology. And I have his certifications. He's been a mentor to me. And then I got involved with the Institute of Coaching, which is endowed by Harvard's Medical School. And they take a highly academic and very research-minded approach to what coaching is. So from a marketing perspective, from time to time, you'll hear that Marshall Goldsmith or Tony Robbins or one of these people are the godfathers of coaching. I think Richard Boyatzis, Dr. Boyatzis, is that this man's been studying coaching from an academic, peer-reviewed research perspective since the late 60s, which is about, as best I can tell, 20 years prior to it even being an industry. So these are the people that I look up to that take a strong academic approach to how do neural pathways change in the brain. It isn't just behavior modification, it's actual change to some of the central structures, and that gives rise to the field of neuroplasticity, how the brain actually changes. And so what we try to do in my organization is utilize some of the knowledge that's built there to help people think differently and help mindset change. Because if you don't change how someone thinks, you're probably over time not going to change how they act.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, I've been a Stephen Covey devotee and actually certified in his methodology for more than 25 years. And of course, what he says, one of the things, and it's not original with him, but you have to think before you can act. Right. And all acts come out of thought. So that absolutely fits with that, right? You have to have the thought before you can do the action. I want to pick up this coffee cup. Well, I need to pick up the coffee cup, then I can pick it up. Right. Yeah. Same thing is true with anything that you do. So that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, I one time heard it said, and I'm sure you might even know who said it, but somebody said, thought without action is useless, and action without thought is dangerous.
I have heard that before, but I don't remember.
Well, we can credit Covey.
Yeah.
We'll give Covey the credit.
So talk a little bit about mindset and how you go about trying to help somebody change their mindset. That's really what we're talking about, right? Is habits of thinking and that mindset that is the basis of how you think. Am I thinking correctly?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's obviously many ways to do it, and changing mindset, like you and I spoke about again before the show, the word change, like if you invited people to a workshop where it was change your mindset, you would notice that very few people would show up to that workshop. Because at the end of the day, changing how we think for a lot of people is actually frightening, right?
Sure.
One of my mentors says we are all addicted to something, but the one addiction that we have in common is the addiction to our own thinking. And
Mm.
so there's a great Hebrew proverb that dates back, whenever, but it says, all a person's ways seem right to them. And so when I published the book that I wrote on the lizard brain, part of that, part of how the reptilian mind works, which is just a survivalistic perspective of the brain, is to help us maintain stability through believing that we are right. So, Dr. Kirch, I want you to know that everything you think in the moment you think it, you think you're right. Everything I think in the moment I think it, I think I'm right.
Yeah, when you think about it, that has to be the case, because if I didn't think it was right, I would think something else.
That's right. But if you give the prefrontal cortex even a few seconds or a minute or two, we all know, at least I shouldn't say all, many people know, like I could get off this and go, ooh, I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done that. If I give myself some space of time, I can have some evaluation to go, well, maybe that wasn't right. Well, at least one of, because you asked a very specific question about how do we change our mindset. Well, one of the ways that we can do that is to practice this process. We didn't call it this. It's just something that we help people with that is called metacognition. Metacognition is a process by which we can help people examine the way that they think. So literally metacognition, the Greek prefix meta is a referential term to whatever follows it usually. So people that study or in IT, if you study the metadata, it's the data about the data.
Right.
Cognition is just a fancy word for thinking. So metacognition is learning to think about how you think, which many people are not taught to do, right? So think about how you're thinking. So when I came onto your show, as an example, 5 minutes before your show, even though I do this and I speak live quite a bit and I have this company and I do this thing or whatever, I noticed that I'd not spent a lot of time with you or anything like that. And I noticed that I felt a little nervous. But what I noticed it. Metacognition is me actually having an inner dialogue where I'm saying to myself, Steve Scanlon, wow, a little nervousness. And then learning from that as opposed to judging it, right? Because there's two neuroscientific sayings that might be helpful for your listeners. Number one, if you can name it, you can tame it. You see, if I think to myself, don't think about that, don't think about that, don't think about it, I'm not naming it.
Yeah. If I told you, don't think about a blue car.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
and then the
can't do it.
second thing that along with if you can name it, you can tame it. Carl Jung, the great, European psychologist, he had this quip that he said, what we resist persists. So if I feel something like, oh my gosh, I feel a little nervousness being on this show, if I say to myself, don't feel that, don't feel that, what Carl Jung taught us was actually trying to resist emotions and thoughts, magnify them. So rather, when I felt it, I could go, wow, Steve Scanlon, how interesting, right? That I would feel this. I noticed it. I paid attention to it. I even honored it. And by doing so, I could tame it because I'm effectively doing something. And so that's just one of the processes so imagine doing that if you're a CEO or a leader or of any kind or a manager, because you're in the business of helping these people. If we could, through this process, understand how to practice metacognition, that is at least one form of learning how to change mindset, by learning how to pay attention, really close attention, non-judgmental attention to your own thoughts, to your own feelings, and to your own mental activities.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm a performer. I sing, and some of the guys in the chorus that I sing with get really nervous before we go on stage. and they pop drugs to help calm themselves, right? Others, like me, yeah, I get nervous. Typically, I'm nervous until the first few notes come out, and then I'm fine. That's the pattern that I've observed. And the other thing is that I've heard, and some people do this, is they take that nerves or fear and label it as excitement. Because from a physiological standpoint, at least this is what I've read, they're the same. Fear and excitement are two sides of the same coin. And by relabeling that not as anxiety, but as excitement about what's about to happen, it's a similar kind of process, I think.
Absolutely. Well, in fact, there is a process, whether you meant to or not. There is a process called labeling, where we actually label it and give it a word. There's another way to practice metacognition that is called diffusion. So that's something, again, that we practice with our clients, diffusion. So if you come to me, or if your friends in the chorus, if one of them would be even willing to label it, like, wow, most of the time you'll hear, I'm nervous, or I'm worried, or I'm scared, or whatever it is. I'm nervous. I'm nervous. Yeah. Okay. So that language can be an instrument for our growth, because literally in that moment, now I might do this before or after, maybe not in that moment. In the moment, if they can't do anything about it, pop the drug and be done.
Yeah.
Over time, they might learn that the drugs that they're popping might have some contraindications that they don't care about.
Yes, perhaps.
Okay. So there could be another thing, that when you say I'm nervous, you are literally fusing. We're literally, whether we know it or not, this is why neuro-linguistic programming we get this. The language that we use even to ourselves, I'm nervous. You're literally using the verb to be. You are fusing who you are with an emotion. Mm-hmm. I'm nervous. So we take that and go, well, what if we could, in that moment, you're in the boardroom, you're wherever, you're at the chorus, about to sing or whatever. What if you could say, I feel nervous? Literally going from I'm nervous to I feel nervous. It might not seem like much, but you're no longer fused, because if you become nervousness, there's very little you can do about it other than take drugs.
Right.
So the third process in diffusion, you go from I'm nervous to I feel nervous. If we can teach the process of metacognition, you can move to I notice I feel nervous. You become the noticer. Now, someone would ask, why go through all this? Well, let me tell you why. Because if you just are nervousness, you have very little choice. You are only going to do what you've always done, which is to go where you've always gone. If we can move from I'm nervous to, well, I feel nervous, that's already very helpful, to I notice that I feel nervousness. At that point, when you become the noticer, one of the greatest things happens, I think, in terms of human development, is you have a choice. So that process of metacognition, that process of diffusion, if someone ultimately says, why would you do that? Choice. Because if you notice that you feel nervous, then you get to ask different questions. Well, what can I do with that? But if you just are nervousness, there's no questions to be asked. And you often have no choices. Your behavior will follow your feelings and your emotions. So high emotional intelligence is, people that have high EQ and all of that. It's not that they don't get angry or frustrated or worried. They do. We just have a deep understanding of why we feel like that, where it comes from, and then from that have some choices about our responses. So that's ultimately what this is about, is we want to free people to have greater choices to how they respond. And if you don't practice metacognition, if there's no diffusion, it's very difficult to have any choice. You're just going to go where you go.
Right. And I would guess this works for stress and anxiety as well. I mean, to say I am anxious, or I feel anxious, or I notice that I am feeling anxious. Same progression.
I have gone to well, I should say 2 or 3 of the top neuroscientists that I know of in the world. One of them certainly was Dr. Siegel. And I asked him a very specific question because this guy's both an MD and a PhD. He's like one of the smartest human beings I know with regard to neuroscience. And I asked him very specifically a question about cortisol, AKA the stress hormone. Now, I've done enough research on cortisol to know that it goes beyond just a stress response. Cortisol helps regulate heart rate and digestion.
Right.
It's released in your pituitary glands. However, it's present when we feel stress. And I asked Dr. Siegel what he thought about effectively residual and excessive cortisol. I basically asked him what he thought about the condition that we're in modern Western civilization about stress and anxiety. The man took off his glasses and looked at me and said, he thinks it's a greater pandemic. This is literally stress and anxiety are killing people at greater rates than anything else known in human history. And it's completely, I shouldn't say completely, it is controllable to a degree through things like metacognition. Unfortunately, we as human beings start figuring out that we can take medication. However, ask anybody who's on any SSRI, serotonin uptake receptor, or any other of these medications, just ask them to ask their doctor what the long-term effects are of these things, because most of them have horrific and detrimental contraindication to them. And so learning how to practice meditation, learning how to practice stillness, and learning metacognition can be massive to the reduction of cortisol and how we experience stress in our world. So yeah, it's huge.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about presence and meditation and because that's not a topic that we often cover here on the Profit Minds podcast. But I'm a practitioner, right? I meditate every morning, and I'm also ADHD, right? So that little bit of meditation in the morning really helps calm the monkey mind, as it were, right? But talk a little bit about how that fits into your practice, and are the things that you recommend to people that they should do or start doing or try to do?
Well, I don't know that first of all, the fact that it's very interesting what you said. I'm thinking a little bit about something you just said. We don't talk a lot about it, and yet you're a practitioner of it. And for the Profit Minds and for what you're trying to do, I do understand that you're looking probably at more technical, systemic ways to do this and do that and do this and do that. When I first started hearing about meditation, I was the guy possibly in the crowd going, oh my gosh, we're one step away from humming and being on the ground and wearing robes and doing crazy stuff. It didn't seem...
What is all this woo-woo stuff?
That's right. But, to my, I shouldn't say this, but to
your credit.
Well, I was going to say to my shame, unfortunately, I'm the kind of guy, I'm probably a little bit like you because you're so into the science. I dove fairly quickly into, I don't want people telling me that they like it or this or that. I really wanted to understand the science behind it, if there was any. And as it turns out, there's phenomenal, Sharon Begley's work. It's actually very funny. I personally think we have the Dalai Lama to thank for a lot of the science, because the Dalai Lama in the early 2000s and late 90s basically went to a group of neuroscientists and said, we've been doing all this meditating in Buddhism and whatever for years and years and centuries. I wonder if there's any scientific evidence for, we know the spiritual evidence and we're not going to either do more or less based on that, but I am interested in knowing if there's any. And so this group of scientists led by Sharon Begley came together and researched it and began to understand how the insular cortex is impacted so deeply. And for any of your listeners that want to understand the science behind meditation, Dr. Daniel Siegel, who was the pioneer of emotional intelligence, because he wrote that book called Emotional Intelligence in the mid-90s, along with Richie Davidson, I think in 2016 or 17, published a book called Altered Traits, because they actually found that meditating changed your epigenetics. You are literally you can alter your genetic code. It can be, we're talking 10 minutes a day. And for all the people with ADHD and monkey mind that, they come to me and they're like, I don't think you understand, Steve. I have a hard time being still for even a second, right? Well, the irony is the less time you think you have for it, or the less ability you think you have for it, the more you probably need it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we're not talking about transcendental, go sit on the ground and do zero for 2.5 hours, 10 minutes a day. And there are, by now, I'm sure there's 30 apps out there, Insight Timer, Calm, Headspace. I don't know. There's all kinds of, and people come to me and go, what's the best one? The one you use or nothing?
The one that you will use.
That's right.
Yeah, it's because it doesn't do you any good to have it on your phone if you don't start it every day.
They're all good. And learning to be still, disconcerting. And people think, 10 minutes, I can do that. Oh, really? Try. Right? If you're a practitioner that there are days where you can find some stillness, and then there are days where you take one breath in and can't, oh my God, I got a concert tonight. I got to think about the kids. I got that. What am I going to have for lunch? Oh my gosh, I should buy a boat. I don't know, like what you're thinking. And learning to come back to stillness and then leave it and come back and leave it. That's like an exercise. But as it turns out, it's a brain exercise that's equivalent to bench pressing. And so learning how to be still and practice meditation isn't always about stillness. It's learning how to notice that your brain went there and learning how to come back. And then it went here and learning how to come back. And so some people try it twice, think they're bad at it, get frustrated, only to hopefully learn later that, I guess there are masters of it who can truly do stillness. I haven't been, and I've been practicing it for years. There are days when I'm a little better at it, but it's a remarkable process, but not just for the sake of some spiritual thing or anything. I mean, if people use it for that, that's fine. I'm telling you in terms of life, how you live, being a leader, growing your business. I've told leaders of Fortune 500 companies, hey, you want a great company? Practice meditation. Let's practice metacognition. How does every great athlete in the world figure this out? Right? If you want to be great
in the zone. Right? They get in, that's the way they describe it, but that's what they're in the moment.
Yeah. Well, I call on you, even though you said we don't talk about that a lot. I think you should have 4 guests on that talk specifically about it. I'm just a practitioner. I'm not any kind of expert. I can read what the experts say, but I'm a practitioner of it, and it's been a huge benefit to my life. So don't know that I need all the scientific evidence when the anecdotal evidence to myself has been that fruitful.
Yeah. So I understand you have a gift to offer our listeners.
Yeah, about 6 or 7 years ago, I published a book on the lizard brain. Many people have heard of the lizard brain. There's a pretty big debate out there in the neuroscience world about what it is, or even if it even is. But my book is a simple little story type book about one guy's journey. It was as much an autobiography as anything. But as we talked about the lizard brain, my team and I built a quiz called the Lizard Quiz. So we all have a lizard brain. Our lizard brain primarily regulates our survival. And primarily, if I wanted to summarize what the lizard brain did, the lizard brain in all of us is doing everything it can to keep us the same. Right? So remember, you're here, you have clothes on, and by the looks of you, you're doing pretty good. That's all the brain needs to go, do that again, which is great. Until you want to grow. And then doing things again might not be in conjunction with our growth. So I wrote a book about the lizard brain called Still the Lizard. By the way, if you're a TED Talk watcher, Seth Godin did a talk out there called Quiet the Lizard Brain. Lots of people have talked about, you're not going to kill this part of your brain because it's protecting your survival anyway. But we can learn to still it or quiet it. So Still the Lizard is my book. And as part of that, we built a quiz, and it's free. And people can, we'll put it in the show notes. Your team will figure out how to put it in the show notes. You can go and take the lizard quiz. I will tell you that it's the people that I did it with. There was a specific doctor at UCLA that we did this with who asked me not to do it because of the lack of scientific research behind it. We did it anyway because I said, what if we weren't trying to create a diagnostic? We were only trying to create a dialogue. So this is not a diagnostic test. It is a quiz from which we can begin a dialogue about understanding how this survivalistic part of your brain works. And if you take it, it's kind of fun and you can kind of see, but we can actually have a different score from our lizard quiz, which will give us indications on the 4 different characteristics of the lizard brain. It's fairly simple and people can have it for free.
Great. And if people just want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out?
Yeah, Rewire Inc. Again, I have to put that little INC on there. Otherwise, they might get some electrical company. But rewireinc.com is our organization. I'm fairly easy. I've done everything I can not to be hard to find, right? I mean, I'm not a huge social media guy. Maybe you can have me back on the show and I'll tell you why some of the detriments to lots of social media on the brain. And so I've had to walk my talk there. But we're on LinkedIn and I'm on LinkedIn. So I'm fairly easy, Steve Scanlon, to be on LinkedIn. So you can probably put that in the show notes. It's so funny. I speak a lot around the country and people are like, I can't believe you're giving people your name and number. And I'm like, I would love to get, if people reach out to me, I'm pretty good about getting back to them directly. So feel free to reach out to me if there's anything I can do from a coaching. We have 18 coaches around the country. My partner lives in Maryland and we've got this really wonderful business and we love to help people change in the way that they think.
That's great. And that concludes our show. Thanks so much to my guest, Steve Scanlon, the CEO and founder of Rewire Inc. I hope you learned something about, how to change the way you think so you can change your business and your life. I know I did. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.